I grew up in the hallways of the Caldwell Inn, where every creaky floorboard held the echoes of childhood laughter and every brass doorknob carried the warmth of my father's touch. My name is Sophia Caldwell, and for as long as I can remember, that hotel was more than a building. It was our family's heartbeat. My father, Charles Caldwell, inherited it from his father and turned it from a rundown lakeside lodge into a charming vintage sanctuary nestled in the hills of Vermont. While my older brother Matthew pursued business degrees overseas and rarely returned, I stayed. I loved the inn, and under my management, it bloomed. I introduced modern booking systems, updated rooms without losing their antique charm, started hosting seasonal events, and even earned us a coveted 5-star rating from a national travel magazine. But everything changed the day he passed away. It was a heart attack, sudden, cruel. He had been fine the day before, helping set up for a springtime festival, laughing as he carried crates of daffodils. I remember because we had argued that morning about some new wallpaper I'd picked for the blue room. I wanted something soft and oceanic. He insisted on floral. We never got to settle it. His funeral was a fog. The town came out in full, guests from years past sent flowers, and our staff mourned like they'd lost their own parent. And in the middle of my grief, in swept Matthew, draped in a custom suit and city airs, speaking of corporate visions and long overdue modernization. At the will reading, everything began to unravel. My father had split the estate between us, but had named Matthew as acting chairman of the family trust until we both reached consensus on the future. It was his way of hoping we'd work together, but Matthew saw it as carte blanche. Within 2 weeks, he called a meeting and said he was assuming full control of operations. He cited my emotional state, the need for fresh direction, and said that perhaps I needed a break. He brought in consultants with big city resumes and colder hearts. They spoke in spreadsheets and trends, wanting to rebrand the inn as a party resort. I resisted, of course, I fought, but no one listened. Matthew controlled the board. The loyal staff who had worked with us for years were quietly replaced. The antique armchairs disappeared, replaced with plastic lounge pods. They drained the lake to build a water slide. The reading room became a bar. I remember the day I left. It was raining. I packed my things in silence while the new general manager, some 20-something influencer with a clipboard, toured the halls with a drone photographer. No one said goodbye. I didn't even get to keep the keys. I stood outside in the drizzle, looking up at the sign my father once hand-carved, now covered in a vinyl logo with bubble letters and neon colors. Caldwell Inn was gone. I moved to Boston and started working for a boutique hotel chain that appreciated heritage. I kept my head down and rebuilt my confidence. But every now and then I'd check the reviews. I watched as ratings dropped, loyal customers posted angry blogs, and travel writers lamented the loss of one of Vermont's hidden gems. It hurt deeply, but not because I missed the job. I missed what it meant. My father had trusted me, that place was our legacy, and my own brother had destroyed it for profits he didn't even manage to make. Then one evening, while attending a regional hospitality conference, I overheard a conversation that stopped me cold. 2 bankers were discussing foreclosure listings, and one mentioned the Caldwell Inn. "That place is hemorrhaging money," he said. "They'll default in under 3 months if no buyer steps up." I left the conference early that night, heart-pounding, not with grief but with purpose. For the first time since I'd left, I knew exactly what I needed to do. In the weeks that followed the conference, I moved with a precision that surprised even myself. My years managing the Caldwell Inn had honed a skill set far deeper than hospitality. They'd made me a strategist, a negotiator, a quiet tactician who understood people. I didn't act on impulse. I acted on instinct sharpened by years of watching guests, partners, and staff, knowing when to offer a warm blanket and when to pull it away. I called Irene the next morning. She was more than just a friend. She had been my silent partner, my sounding board when I was managing the inn, and a creative genius in her own right. After I left Vermont, she started her own PR firm, catering to luxury and heritage brands, and she'd done well for herself. When I told her what I'd learned about Caldwell Inn's looming foreclosure, there was a beat of silence on the line. "So you're going to save it again?" she said. It wasn't a question. I exhaled, "Not save it, reclaim it." We met the next weekend in a quiet cafe near Cambridge. She brought a legal pad and a gleam in her eye. I brought blueprints I'd kept from the renovation phase years ago, napkins filled with ideas I never got to implement, and a folder of screenshots, old reviews from our loyal guests, photos they had shared, handwritten letters I'd saved in a box labeled "for rainy days." "We won't buy it as Sophia Caldwell," Irene said. "If we do, Matthew will fight it out of pride. He'd rather lose everything than let you have it. We buy it anonymously, through a shell company, then we make it everything it was meant to be." And so the plan was born. I created an LLC under a different name, registered out of state. Irene connected me with a real estate lawyer who specialized in distressed properties. Within 2 weeks, we began quietly acquiring debt notes associated with the inn. It turned out Matthew had leveraged not just the property, but even the family land around it. He had been trying to build a flashy retreat center that never got past the zoning board. The hotel was bleeding cash. Guest occupancy was below 20%, the utilities had been shut off twice, and employee turnover was nearly 100% in the last 18 months. Staff hadn't been paid on time in weeks. Morale was dead. What was once a soul-rich establishment had become a sinking, soulless box. In the middle of the chaos, I visited the town again unannounced, unnoticed. I stayed in a roadside inn and wore a baseball cap low over my eyes. I walked the grounds of the Caldwell Inn at dusk just as the sun dipped behind the lake. The new sign was flickering, half-lit, paint peeled from the shutters. The famous willow tree where my father had once officiated weddings had been chopped down, replaced with a modern steel pergola. My throat tightened. The next morning, I began calling old employees. I found Marlene, who had been our head of housekeeping for 30 years before she was let go without warning. I reached out to Oscar, the night concierge who used to play the piano for guests in the lounge. One by one, they answered. One by one, they said yes. They missed the place, not the building, but the feeling. Over the next month, Irene and I worked around the clock. We presented a formal bid to acquire Caldwell Inn as part of a foreclosure negotiation. The bank was eager to recoup its losses, and when they saw our financials and plans for revitalization, they didn't hesitate. Matthew never even saw it coming. By the time the papers were signed, it was done. He found out the day after the sale was finalized. I received a single text, "You bought it." I didn't respond. Instead, I walked through the front doors of the inn the next morning, keys in hand, clipboard ready, and an army of loyal staff waiting by the lake. We began the restoration immediately, not just cosmetic changes, not just paint and wood, but a full resurrection of its spirit. The floral wallpapers were returned to the blue room. The library was refurnished with oak and velvet. We rehired locals, paid fair wages, and involved artists and musicians in the revival. Every week, we filmed the progress and posted it under a social media project called Bringing Caldwell Back. The videos went viral. People shared their memories. Couples posted anniversary photos taken years ago on the front steps. Children, now grown, talked about winter breaks spent sipping hot cocoa by the fire. We turned nostalgia into momentum. As the summer approached, we announced a grand reopening weekend, reservation only, limited guests, and a lineup of events honoring the inn's history. By then, media outlets had picked up the story of the mysterious investor who had saved one of Vermont's most beloved landmarks. They didn't know it was me yet. The weekend sold out in 6 hours. 3 days before the reopening, I received another text from Matthew. This one said, "Meet me, one drink." I ignored it. The Caldwell Inn was no longer a war between siblings. It was a restoration of a legacy, and I had no intention of slowing down to explain that to someone who threw it all away. Let the inn speak for itself. The morning of the grand reopening was unusually crisp for June. Mist clung to the hills behind the inn like a quiet curtain being drawn open, and the lake shimmered with a soft gold sheen as if the world itself was welcoming the Caldwell Inn back. I stood on the second-floor balcony overlooking the grounds, dressed in a simple navy blazer, my father's old pocket watch tucked into the inside flap. This was no ordinary reopening, this was resurrection. Guests began arriving just before noon. Some came in sleek town cars, others in dusty SUVs with kids peeking out the windows, eyes wide with wonder. A few older couples walked slowly up the stone steps, pausing to take in every detail. I stood back behind the main lobby's floral archway, watching their expressions. Awe, recognition, tears in some cases. There was one woman, probably in her 70s, who clasped her hands to her mouth as she saw the reading room restored exactly as it had been. The same lamp, the same red armchair by the window. She turned to her husband and whispered, "That's where you proposed." I felt my eyes sting. By mid-afternoon, the inn was filled with the kind of noise I hadn't heard in years, the joyful hum of shared history. Irene worked the floor like a magician, weaving between reporters, travel bloggers, and guests with ease. She made sure the narrative held an anonymous investor with a heart for heritage. The mystery of the Caldwell Inn's revival only fed public interest. Caldwell Returns was trending nationwide. I kept to the edges, not out of fear but out of reverence. This wasn't about me. It was about the place, the people who loved it, and the dignity it had earned. That was until Matthew arrived. He did RSVP. Of course he didn't. He arrived near dusk, just as the sun broke through a cloud and lit up the west wing in a golden blaze. He wore an expensive blazer that hung too loose on his frame, his eyes scanning the crowd like a man who'd come home only to find his key no longer worked. I watched him from behind the bar. At first he didn't see me. He walked through the lounge slowly, eyes darting from restored paintings to familiar furnishings. I could see the confusion brewing in his expression. This wasn't the hollow shell he left behind. This was something real, and worse for him, it was thriving. He finally spotted me as I stepped out from behind the bar to greet one of the musicians. Our eyes met across the room, and for a second, everything stilled. His face was unreadable. Mine, I hoped, was calm. I didn't flinch. I nodded once. He approached slowly. "You did all this." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let the room answer for me, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the scent of cedar and old books restored to life. Finally, I said, it was never gone. It just needed someone to remember. You bought it behind my backs. I tilted my head. It was already gone, Matthew. You sold its soul a long time ago. I just happened to be the only one who wanted it back. He laughed once bitterly. You were always sentimental. You think nostalgia pays the bills. I turned toward the front desk, where a queue of guests waited to check in for the extended weekend. Apparently it does. Matthew looked around again. For a flicker of a moment, he seemed smaller, not in stature, but in weight, as if he realized that whatever power he once held had melted away. I should have never. You didn't just ruin a business, I cut in quietly. You gutted a memory, you took something beautiful and tried to make it shallow, and people noticed. He didn't argue. For once, he just stood there, his silence an admission. Then he did something I didn't expect. He walked over to the portrait wall near the dining room and stared at the framed photo of our father, the one taken just a year before he passed, standing in front of the willow tree, arms crossed, smile quiet but proud. He would have hated what I did. He would have been proud of how it ended, I said, standing beside him. Matthew turned to face me. Is there a place for me in this, to help, to learn from it maybe? I looked at him long and hard, and for a moment I did feel a pull, a twinge of the old sibling bond, the echo of children racing down the inn's halls, but then I remembered the years in between, the damage, the silence when I needed support. There's a place here, I said slowly, but not for someone chasing profit, not for ego. If you want to help, start by listening, really listening, not to me but to them, the staff, the guests, the walls. He nodded once, just once, and walked out. The next morning I found a note slid under my door. No signature, just a torn scrap from one of our old notepads. It read, "You brought it back, I see that now, thank you." I tucked it away in the same drawer where I kept my father's last letter. Then I returned to work, to the heartbeat of the inn, where a legacy no longer mourned but thrived. The weeks after the reopening passed in a kind of golden blur. The Caldwell Inn was not just restored, it was reborn. And yet what surprised me the most wasn't how fast we filled our rooms or how quickly the press picked up our story again. It was the way the soul of the place, that quiet, timeless warmth, seemed to rush back in the moment the right people returned to its walls. Marlene resumed her post as head of housekeeping with a vengeance. She ran her department with the same proud elegance she always had, greeting returning guests like long-lost family. Oscar played piano again in the lounge every Friday night, drawing couples and even children to gather around in a circle of soft nostalgia. Irene managed all our brand collaborations and press inquiries with a shield of grace, always protecting the spirit of what we were trying to do. The inn wasn't a business to me, it was a promise, a contract with history. Still, not everything was calm. We had our first storm less than a month after reopening, not just a literal thunderstorm that knocked out power for a full afternoon, but the arrival of someone who threatened to undo everything we'd built. His name was Leonard Delgado. He owned a string of luxury resort properties up the East Coast, known for their glamour, exclusivity, and complete lack of character. He had approached my father once with a buyout offer that my dad rejected on the spot. "We don't build memories to sell them," my father had said. Now Delgado was back, and this time he wasn't offering, he was observing. I first saw him on a Sunday morning. He booked under an alias, but I recognized him immediately as he stepped out of a silver Range Rover and adjusted his sunglasses with an air of self-importance that could be felt from across the lawn. He toured the property quietly, took notes, asked the staff pointed questions. When I finally confronted him, politely, professionally, he smiled as if we were old friends. "You've done something remarkable here, Sophia," he said smoothly. "I underestimated you." "You didn't underestimate me, you ignored me," I replied, "and that's not the same." He chuckled, "Fair, but now I'm here to propose something different. I'm not looking to buy, I'm looking to invest, expand, franchise the Caldwell brand. It has power, and people love a comeback story." I let the silence hang for a moment, then I said simply, "This place isn't a product." "Everything is a product," he said with a shrug. "You just haven't priced it right yet." I ended the conversation before it soured further. But over the next few days I noticed things: anonymous offers emailed to our front desk manager, notes left with Irene's assistant, rumors that Delgado was speaking with town council members about acquiring the land adjacent to ours. He wanted to build a luxury annex, one of those tasteless glass monoliths that would tower over the historic inn like a monument to greed. I called an emergency meeting with our core staff. Irene was already one step ahead with a dossier of Delgado's past developments, each one a cautionary tale of small towns pushed out, local businesses ruined, traditions paved over with faux sophistication. Marlene stood up halfway through the meeting and said, "Let him try, we outlasted worse." That night I didn't sleep. I walked the grounds alone thinking. My father's words came back to me. The inn is only as strong as its story. If you forget that, the walls won't hold. I had an idea, risky, maybe even foolish, but I knew it was time to make our story impossible to steal. The next morning, we launched a campaign called This is Caldwell. We invited former guests, longtime staff, and townsfolk to share their stories, real memories of the inn, filmed simply in black and white. No marketing spin, just truth. We partnered with a small documentary filmmaker who had once stayed at the inn as a teenager and credited it with saving her life during a dark time. She jumped at the opportunity. The result was stunning. People cried watching the stories. A man spoke of scattering his wife's ashes by the willow tree 20 years ago. A woman shared a photo of her and her mother baking cookies in our kitchen during a mother-daughter weekend retreat. Children remembered fireflies in jars and learning how to skip stones by the lake. The videos went viral, not in a flashy, trending way, but in a quiet wave of emotion that swept through social media and hospitality circles alike. Within a week, we were booked out for the rest of the year. Delgado didn't approach me again. His people canceled the land meeting with the town council, and 3 weeks later I heard his luxury annex plans had been redirected to a city outside Albany. He left without saying goodbye. We won not through lawsuits or power plays, but by reminding people that real places still exist, places that remember. As summer turned to fall, the inn became more than just busy, it became whole again. Couples returned year after year, families planned reunions. We hosted our first writers' retreat in October, and I sat in on the final readings with tears in my eyes, listening to strangers put words to the very feeling I had been chasing for years, belonging. One evening, I stood on the wraparound porch as the sun sank low behind the hills, casting the inn in a glow of amber and shadow. Irene joined me, wine glass in hand. "You know," she said, "this isn't just a hotel anymore, it's a movement." I laughed, tired and proud. "No," I said, "it's a promise, and we kept it." Inside, the piano started playing. Oscar had begun his nightly set, and as the familiar notes drifted into the air, I closed my eyes and let it wash over me. We were home. Autumn settled into Vermont like a deep exhale. The hills around the Caldwell Inn ignited with color, flames of red, gold, and rust curling down from the treetops, painting the world in memory. It was our busiest season yet, every room booked, every event sold out, every guest walking through the doors seemed to carry with them not just luggage but intention. They weren't here to be pampered. They were here to belong, to reconnect, to remember. I watched it unfold with a quiet joy, and then, as if summoned by the weight of completion, Matthew returned. This time it wasn't unannounced. He called ahead, spoke with Irene, asked if he could schedule a meeting with me. He didn't pretend anymore. There were no threats, no arrogance, no posture, just a request. I agreed, out of curiosity, perhaps out of closure. He arrived just after noon on a Wednesday. The inn was humming but not crowded. The fire in the lounge was lit, casting an orange warmth over the velvet chairs. We sat across from each other at a corner table near the window where the light fell soft through the old glass panes. He looked older, more tired than he had months ago. The sharp lines in his face had softened, but his eyes held something new. Not defeat, not regret, something in between. "I watched the documentary," he began, "all 5 parts twice." I said nothing. I didn't know people felt that way about this place. I didn't know Dad meant so much to them. I raised an eyebrow. "You didn't want to know." He nodded. "Yeah, that's probably true. I thought building something meant changing everything, making it bigger, louder, newer, but what you built? It's quiet, but it echoes." There was a long silence between us, the kind that only siblings can share. A silence full of childhood laughter, teenage arguments, and years of estrangement folded into it like creases in an old letter. "I lost my apartment," he said suddenly. "After the annex deal fell through, investors pulled out. I'm back in the city doing consulting work here and there." I nodded once, letting him speak. "I'm not here to ask for money," he added quickly, "and I'm not trying to get involved in this place again. I wouldn't presume to. I guess I wanted to see it for myself, see what you made of it." I studied him. There was truth in his voice. For the first time in years, I believed he wasn't trying to spin an angle. He looked around, out the window, toward the lake. "Peace," he said, "and permanence, you made it timeless." A small smile tugged at my lips, not pride exactly, something quieter, fulfillment. "I brought something," he added, reaching into his coat pocket. He placed a thin, worn envelope on the table. My name was written on the front in our father's handwriting. My breath caught. "I found it when I was cleaning out the last of my boxes," he said. "I think it was meant for you." I picked it up with careful hands. The paper felt delicate, like it might dissolve with too much pressure. I opened it slowly, eyes scanning the faded ink. It wasn't long, just a single paragraph, my father's words clear and steady. "Sophia, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to say it out loud. The inn is yours, not by inheritance, not by law, by heart. You understand it better than anyone. I see what you do when no one's looking, the way you care for people, for details, for the past. Keep it alive and forgive Matthew. He means well even if he forgets how to show it. Love, Dad. I folded the letter back into the envelope and held it against my chest. Matthew stood, hesitated. I'll go, I don't want to make things awkward. You already did, I said, but gently. He smiled almost sheepishly. Fair. As he turned to leave, I spoke. There's a handyman job open, room and board included. It's not glamorous. You'll be fixing pipes and carrying wood and listening. He froze, then slowly turned back to me. Seriously. No one's above starting over, not even a Caldwell's. He looked like he might cry. Instead, he nodded. 2 days later, he moved into one of the back cottages. No fanfare, no title, just Matthew, a toolkit, and a borrowed pair of boots. And to his credit, he worked, quietly, earnestly. The staff was skeptical at first, but over time, even Marlene warmed up. She caught him once fixing the old heater in the blue room, muttered something about finally being useful, and handed him a cinnamon scone without looking him in the eye. We didn't talk much in those early weeks, but every now and then I'd see him standing by the lake, watching the sun rise, and I knew something in him had shifted. Autumn deepened. We hosted a harvest festival that drew in over 300 visitors. Local artisans filled the lawn, children bobbed for apples, elderly couples danced to live bluegrass beneath the golden trees. I stood on the front steps watching it all unfold, Irene by my side, and for once, for just a moment, I didn't feel like I had to hold the world together. It held itself. And that night, as I walked past the barn on my way back to the main house, I saw Matthew standing under the string lights, sweeping hay off the floor. He looked up. Place looks good, Soph. It does, I said. Thanks for helping keep it that way. He nodded. It's weird. I used to think I had to own everything. Now I just want to be part of something that lasts. I didn't answer. I just smiled, stepped inside, and closed the door behind me. Maybe forgiveness wasn't a grand act. Maybe it was moments like this, earned slowly across time, across work, across quiet grace. And maybe home wasn't just a place we saved. Maybe it was the place that saved us. Winter arrived gently that year, as if even the seasons had learned to move with respect around the Caldwell Inn. Snow dusted the window sills like powdered sugar, smoke curled from every chimney, and the lake, once a mirror of sunlight, froze over into a still, glassy surface that seemed to hold the sky itself. It was beautiful, not dramatic, not grandiose, just right. December was always the most sacred month at the inn. My father used to say it was when the house remembered its own bones, when the cold forced people to draw close, to share stories over cider, to light candles not just for warmth but for hope. We honored that tradition with quiet reverence. No neon lights, no gimmicky decor, just handmade garlands, soft choral music, and a tree in the main hall decorated with ornaments donated by guests from every generation. I spent most evenings in the library, not working, just sitting, listening, the kind of listening you do with your whole body, to the walls, to the past, to the rhythm of a place that had finally found its breath again. Matthew worked the morning shifts mostly. He kept the paths shoveled before dawn, checked on the water lines, repaired old floorboards. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and when he did, it was soft and considered. One morning I caught him teaching a young intern how to rewire a porch light. He smiled, not the kind he used to flash at boardrooms, but something smaller, something earned. Irene stayed on longer than she'd planned. I came for a relaunch, she said once, laughing over a mug of mulled wine. But now it feels like I'm watching history take root. How do you walk away from that? The guests that winter were some of our most devoted. Many were returning families, now bringing their grandchildren. Others were new, drawn in by the stories they'd seen online, curious if such a place could truly exist. One couple, newly engaged, said they'd been planning to elope in Paris until they saw our short film and changed all their plans. This place, the bride-to-be said, clutching my hand, feels like it was waiting for us. It wasn't all perfect. The boiler failed on Christmas Eve. A batch of cranberry scones burned because someone confused Fahrenheit for Celsius, and one guest's dog chewed through the corner of a hand-woven rug from 1912. But somehow none of it mattered, or maybe it did in the way only real, lived-in places can allow for imperfection and still feel whole. On New Year's Eve, we hosted a candlelit dinner followed by a bonfire by the frozen lake. Guests wrote their hopes for the new year on slips of parchment and fed them into the flames. Children chased each other with sparklers. The staff danced in woolen scarves and rubber boots. Marlene brought out an accordion. Oscar played Auld Lang Syne on the piano, and I swear I could feel my father in the room. Matthew stood beside me as the countdown began, not close, just near enough. When the clock struck midnight and the hilltops echoed with soft cheers and the clinking of mugs, he looked over at me. Thank you, he said simply, for letting me be part of it. Thank you for earning it, I replied. He nodded and turned back to the fire. I watched his face in the glow, not just older now, but honest. I saw the boy who used to build snow forts with me behind the inn, and for the first time in many years, I didn't feel like I was carrying the Caldwell name alone. A few weeks later, we received a letter from the Vermont Heritage Council. The Caldwell Inn was being awarded official historical landmark status, citing our commitment to preserving both architecture and tradition. Irene cried, I laughed. Matthew, who had been oiling the hinges on the front doors, paused and said, Dad would have bragged about this to every guest for the next 10 years. Spring came early, snow melted into wildflowers, birds returned to the trees that once lined the lake. We began expanding carefully, intentionally, a writing cabin, a small greenhouse, a scholarship program for students pursuing hospitality with heart, and with each step I felt less like I was building something new and more like I was extending a story that finally had space to keep going. One morning in April, I found an envelope waiting for me in the front office. No return address. Inside was a short typed note. Your story reminded me what places can mean. Thank you for not selling it. Thank you for remembering. It was signed only with an initial. Delgado, I assumed, but it didn't matter. He wasn't the villain anymore. He was just part of the landscape now, like so many others who had passed through, changed, and moved on. We held our first annual Caldwell Inn Storytellers Festival that June. Guests and locals gathered to share tales, real, fictional, poetic, all inspired by memory and place. The closing night featured a reading from a teenage girl who had come with her grandmother. She read a poem titled Home is the Place That Waits. I don't remember every word, but I remember the last line, and when I arrived, it remembered me back. That night, as I walked through the halls, I paused by the portrait of my father, the same one Matthew had once stood in front of. I touched the frame and whispered, we did it. Then I turned and walked upstairs, into the quiet, into the warmth, into the inn that had become not just a place, but a legacy held in motion, a story still being written. And this time I wasn't writing it alone.